Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the second session of our fall-winter series on juvenile justice and change. We have another really interesting series of sessions to keep you occupied today. Just wanted to give you a couple of housekeeping notes. First of all, a number of you had questions for our panelists, which were left unanswered yesterday, and I passed them on to Nate Bayless and our other panelists, and as soon as they come up with their answers, I'll post them on the conference page. And also, just note that the conference page, as I said yesterday, should be your main point of contact. You should be checking that fairly regularly over the next week to see what new stuff we've got on. Our next session after this is going to be next Thursday, October 29th. You'll take a look at the agenda. If you haven't already downloaded it, please do. And please also download the bios of all of our speakers. They're more comprehensive. We'll introduce the speakers as they appear, but they'll be brief snippets. So if you want to see the entire bio, I would download that and print it. Our first session, we're going to just segue on some of the things that Nate Bayless was talking about yesterday. Also, for your reference, we have a story in the Crown Report today covering some of what Nate Bayless did, so it's worth looking at. But we're looking at youth racial justice and the pandemic. So they're two really big stories. We're not big issues, and we're not going to obviously cover them in total detail, but we want to give you some of the ideas that we have from our speakers about how to cover these things better. And to lead us in the conversation, we have Joe Dominick, our journalism coordinator. So Joe, say hello if we can put your video on the screen. And Joe will introduce our various speakers. Joe can hear me.
I can hear you.
Okay. Can you put your video on? I think the video is not on.
Yeah, I need perhaps Chris to put my video on.
Yeah, he's going to do that right away.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Joe. Over to you.
Okay. Folks still aren't seeing me, but I'm Joe Domanick, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center here on Media, Crime, and Justice. And we're going to be speaking today to Dominique Nong, who is the Director of Youth Justice Policy at the Children's Defense Fund, and Stephen B. Kang, who focuses on the rights of non-citizens, including children, families, and individuals with mental disabilities who are subjected to detention. So we're going to start right now with Steve. Dominique will be joining us shortly. I'm still having trouble with oh yeah, okay, folks are seeing me now. Terrific. Okay, so I'm going to start with Stephen Kang. Steve, can you tell us what you've been doing during the pandemic? Steve is a civil rights and civil liberties lawyer, and one of my real heroes, along with all of the folks that who are involved in juvenile justice, all of the attorneys who have been doing incredible work over the past decade. So Steve, tell us a little bit about what you've been doing.
Sure. And so I'm an attorney at the ACLU Immigrants Rights Project. And so where we work on a broad range of issues concerning the civil rights and liberties of non-citizens who are subject to deportation. And so like Joe mentioned, my focus has been, while I've been at the ACLU, on the rights of kids and families and other people with special vulnerabilities who are subject to deportation. And I think, it's interesting because I think for us here, I think COVID, and for me in particular, I think COVID has really shifted the landscape for us in different respects in terms of the subject areas that we focus on and the emphasis of our work. Because I think historically, a lot of our work has obviously been focused on in limiting detention for children and families who are subject to deportation. As in ensuring procedures to ensure that they get out of custody faster, that their conditions while they're in custody are more humane, and basically and also focusing on efforts to increase due process rights for in their deportation proceedings. And so that historically has been a huge emphasis of our work. I think COVID has really affected that in different ways. And I think Dominique's probably going to talk about this in a little bit more detail, because there are some sort of interesting comparisons and contrasts with what's going on in the juvenile justice system when you compare it to what's going on in the immigration system right now. And so, you may know that, a lot of the ACLU's work over the last 8 or 9 months has been focused on getting people out of ICE custody. And ICE is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, for those who don't know. And they're the agency that's typically responsible for detaining and deporting non-citizens, adult non-citizens and families who are in the deportation and removal system. And so a lot of our work has been focused on the last 7 months, 8 months on ensuring that people, particularly those with medical vulnerabilities who are in ICE custody, can be more safely and effectively released from custody into their communities so that they don't catch COVID and basically, get a serious illness or die. Because as you may know, I think CDC reports show that if you have some kind of pre-existing medical vulnerability, getting COVID is much more likely. You're much more likely to die or have some kind of ongoing system-wide health problem if you're infected.
And so what has that experience been like for you? Has it been, one knows about what's going on with ICE? Has that been a frustrating experience, or have you been able to achieve something?
Yeah, I think we've achieved a lot. I think we filed at the ACLU, I want to say dozens of lawsuits throughout the country, often in conjunction with our affiliate partners. And so for those who don't know, I work at the national ACLU, but there's also local ACLUs in each state that do more on the ground work. And so in partnership with those affiliate organizations, we filed I would say dozens of lawsuits throughout the country that have helped get hundreds of non-citizens out of ICE custody, particularly those who have medical vulnerabilities. So I think we've met with a lot of success in that regard. I think where it sort of contrasts, though, with the situation of kids is that, I think the way COVID has affected juveniles in immigration custody the most concretely is that the vast majority of juveniles who are in immigration detention, and when I say juveniles here, I mean unaccompanied children who come to the United States by themselves or are arrested by themselves outside the company of a parent. Oh, sorry.
And what kind of, before you continue, what kind of numbers are we talking about? With those kids?
Yeah, I think typically, in years past, there were maybe tens of thousands of unaccompanied children who came to the United States every year. And that number has really varied up and down over time, depending on conditions in Central America for the most part. But I think in recent years, it's ranged in the tens of thousands. So.
Wow, yeah. Okay, so please continue with what you were saying.
Sure. And so historically, unaccompanied children have come to the United States, often seeking safety. What they're often doing is fleeing grave persecution in their home countries, typically in Central America, and seeking humanitarian relief in the United States. And so there's a set of statutes that basically ensure that unaccompanied children who come to the United States are treated humanely and are processed for fair deportation proceedings so that they can make effective claims for humanitarian relief and asylum in the United States. And the main statute at issue is called the TVPRA, which is the Torture Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. And it's an overall pretty protective federal statute that guarantees a lot of rights for unaccompanied children in custody. And one of the main rights that it grants, especially for those children who are not from Mexico, from Central American countries for the most part, is that they have to be referred to the custody of the Department of Health and Human Services, which is responsible for their welfare and their custody, and also responsible for finding community placements for them, for releasing them to family members and relatives and sponsors in the country. Yeah.
So has part of your work during the pandemic been focused on doing exactly that?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about the pandemic is that, this administration is pretty well known, obviously, for its anti-immigrant sentiments. And I think one of the main focuses of the Trump administration's efforts on immigration for the last 8 months since COVID is basically to institute a ban on the migration of people who don't have documentation, who come to the northern and southern borders and the ports. And so basically what they did was that through the Centers for Disease Control, they issued a series of regulations and policies that have the effect of essentially banning entry of all non-citizens who come to the border and lack documentation. And so there's no general exceptions to this ban, so it does encompass unaccompanied children who come to the border alone. And so what the CDC order and regulations do is allow the government and the Department of Homeland Security really to immediately turn around or expel all children who come to the border seeking safety in the United States. And so what that has had, interestingly, is it has had the effect of decreasing the number of children in custody for sure, you know, because right now the ORR shelter network is down to like something like a 5 to 8% capacity. But they're doing that by essentially expelling all the children who try to come into their care and turning them back around and returning them often to countries where they're fleeing grave danger. Mm-hmm. And so that's been, in our view, a serious problem. Yeah.
But what has ICE been doing in terms of the children that they have incarcerated during the pandemic? I mean, have they been responsive? Have they been humane? Have they been trying to make sure that the kids are protected? Give us a picture of what's going on and what you've been trying to do and what you've been successful at accomplishing and what you haven't been successful at accomplishing.
Yeah, so I think, you know, it's important here to distinguish, because I think what I was saying earlier is that ICE actually is responsible for holding adults for the most part. So there's different agencies with different responsibility over non-citizens facing deportation. So ICE is the agency that has custody over adults, and that's the set of lawsuits I was referring to earlier. And they do hold a very limited set of children. Typically children who come with families are housed in what's called family detention centers that are typically located in Texas. Where, you know, family units are held, and so that what that often means is a parent with small children, and so that's, you know, so ICE does hold a limited set of kids, but it's relatively limited compared. And unaccompanied children, in contrast, are held by a different agency called ORR, which is in the Health and Human Services Department, and basically they did that division because it was viewed that ICE basically couldn't responsibly hold children for the most part, and they wanted a more child welfare focused agency to have custody over children who come by themselves. And so, you know, there are sort of two different agencies at issue with respect to the care of kids. I mean, with respect to the care of non-citizens in detention. So,
and how has Human Services been doing in terms of dealing with these kids?
You know, I think, you know, in our view, like, you know, sort of what they're doing is not, you know, I think they have been helped in some respects, like I said, by the fact that, you know, the government has basically stopped accepting new kids. And so what that means is that they have a relatively low shelter capacity right now. Like their overall capacity is somewhere in the 13 to 14,000 range. And they have something like maybe only at last count, maybe around 800 kids in care right now. And so their sort of percentage population is quite low. So I think it does enable them to do things and to help kids keep kids safe that, you know, may have been somewhat more difficult for them if you know, if the situation were different. I think that's in contrast to ICE, what's going on the adult side, where I think we have a lot of concerns with the way that ICE, non-citizens in ICE custody are being held in terms of the conditions of their confinement, as well as making sure that non-citizens can be released safely and effectively in the midst of the pandemic, and especially those with medical vulnerabilities, to avoid their getting COVID infections.
Right, so even though this is about juvenile justice, can you tell us some of the concerns you have in terms of what ICE is doing?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of concerns. You know, I think like, you know, guidance is pretty clear from public health experts that in order to ensure the safe care of people or the safe custody of people in ICE detention, and particularly those with medical vulnerabilities, like ICE should be instituting a lot more policies and procedures to, for example, improve cleaning, and in particular, the main focus is improving social distancing to make sure that you can hold people in custody in a way that minimizes contact with each other that's a lot less than 6 feet. And I think to do that, you need to look at, the physical plans of the detention facilities, like look at how systems are designed, look at things like, who has meals at what times. It requires some extra coordination. And our concern across the ICE system is that ICE is just not doing that. I think they claim that they're complying with CDC guidelines, but in reality, their adherence to those guidelines is questionable often. And also, sometimes the CDC guidelines, frankly, don't go quite far enough in terms of keeping people safe in custody. And so, what's really needed is like better attention to both conditions as well as social distancing and making sure that in particular the latter can happen.
And have you seen any improvement?
I think there's been some improvement as a result of the litigation that we've been talking about. And I think because of I think a lot of the litigation has put pressure on ICE in particular to release people from custody. And so the ICE population is actually down from what it was. It's actually lower than it has been for like the last 4 or 5 years, partly because I think the number of new arrests has gone down, as well as the fact that they've been releasing some more people from custody under pressure from lawsuits. And so in that respect, there's been some improvement, but I think there could be a lot more, especially in certain facilities that we know have been problematic historically and remain pretty problematic now. So,
Okay. Michael, can we get some? Okay, I'm going to take a look at some of the questions that we have up here.
Sorry, Mr. Dominic, I think you cut out for a second. Did you want to have some questions?
Yes, please.
Yes, okay. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yes, so we have one question from a journalist, and the question is, do you think that youth detention centers are being closed to a lack of youth in custody or a shrinking of their budget? Or should a reporter like myself be more skeptical than that?
I think when it comes to youth detention centers and the immigration side, what we're talking about is ORR custody, I believe. I think that's what the reporter is asking about. Thus far, we haven't heard of mass closures in the ORR system, despite their lack of capacity. The lack of numbers of new kids coming in. I think, they still seem to be maintaining their shelter capacity right now. And so we haven't heard of instances where there's been mass closures or sort of planned closures even of ORR shelters across the board. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do we have any other questions, Michael?
Yes. Thank you for that answer, Mr. Kang. Another journalist would like to know, I believe referring to ICE, how did ICE lose the parents of 545 children?
Sure. So this is, I think somewhat different from the conversation that we're having now, but relates more closely to our family separation case called Mizell v. ICE, which is a lawsuit that we filed back in 2018 to challenge the government's policy and practice of separating families, including families with very young children from each other at the border and detaining them in separate locations and sometimes even deporting the parents while the child was separated from them. And so I think, by the time that we won a preliminary injunction in that case, which was in June 2018, thousands of families had already been separated by that time. And I think one of the big problems with that the lawsuit uncovered and that our judge was quite angry about was the fact that there was very little tracking done by ICE and the other agencies involved when families were separated. So they would take apart the parent and the child, send them to different facilities. And there was often, most of the time, there was no sort of paper trail or indication in any ICE databases or records about what, linking essentially the parent to the child. And so when our reunification effort began in June 2018, when we won the preliminary injunction, I think what that uncovered was basically this total lack of documentation and any sort of effort to, in an organized fashion, track what happened to the families. And so what that meant was that we had to force the government to essentially reconstruct a bunch of records to try to match parents and children with each other in an effort to try to reunify them. And then what we discovered was that, many parents had already been deported by the time that our injunction went into place and that they'd already been sent back to their home countries. And so then we had to to institute a whole separate effort to try to locate and find the parents who had been deported in an effort to understand where their situations were, like, and also to ascertain the parents' wishes with respect to the child's custody. Like, do you want the child to come back with you to the United States? Like, what kind of preferences or options do you feel like you want the child to exercise now that you've been separated from them? Can we make any effort to reunify you, et cetera? And so I think because of that, it's been basically a years-long endeavor to try to find all of these parents and try to ascertain their wishes. And I think we're still engaged in the effort to find them. But I think a lot of what this is rooted in is kind of one of the horrible things about family separation, which is that, the government paid very little attention to making sure that, they basically had no intention of reunifying the families, which is why they didn't track them. But I think that's only something we uncovered when the government was actually forced to try to reunify them. So.
Chris, could you bring another question?
You're cutting out, Joe. Could you repeat that?
Sure. Screen, and I'm asking if you have an additional question.
Yes, we do. We just got a lot more questions. Mr. Dominick, I also see that Ms. Nong is here now. I don't know if you wanted to.
Yes, let's put Miss Nong on the screen, and let's put Michael on the screen as well, please, Chris. Chris, okay, let's
Please on the screen, Joe.
Joe, I don't know if you can hear me, but we can bring Dominique right on.
Yeah, let's bring Dominique on, please.
Hi, I'm on.
Hey guys, everybody's on.
Hi, Dominique.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Good to see you. So we've been talking about human services, and we've been talking and kids, and we've been talking a little bit about ICE and how they've been dealing with the pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about what you've been doing as a civil rights and civil liberties attorney during the pandemic, the kind of work that you've been doing and what your objectives have been?
Sure. So good morning, everyone. I do work for the Children's Defense Fund, California. While I am trained as an attorney, most of my work is policy. So so a lot of my focus is going to be on California specifically. And we've actually been doing a lot of advocacy, both on the local and the state level. This can vary by state, but generally when you're talking about locked facilities for young people, they can either be run at the county level and at the state level. And there are two different types. There's either what are sort of the equivalent of jails, sort of these juvenile detention facilities. They're local county run. They hold young people who have been arrested, charged with an offense, and judges feel like they're too much of a public safety risk to have them released back to their homes. Or if you're being held for technical violations or things like that. Then there's sort of the youth version of youth prisons, which are you're found after you're found guilty and you're sent to spend there for a certain amount of time. And so I describe those two things because the advocacy arguments we make will vary depending on who runs the system and what type of facility we're talking about. So when it comes to what we've been doing in California, COVID has presented, for all of its harms, an opportunity to really have us lean in to some of the main arguments that advocates have been making for a while, which is one, you don't need to incarcerate young people. And two, as an alternate to that, you need to be investing in communities, investing in them and community-based services. And so those are the two main things we've been pushing for locally. And then of course, for the young people that are still incarcerated, we have been pushing for a lot of the increased protections that are needed. And Stephen mentioned the CDC guidelines, can also talk about how well they've actually been doing on that. So when it comes to release, we've both advocated, we've had public defenders individually sort of coalesce around for individual clients getting them released. We had some lawyers pull together to file a lawsuit on behalf of all LA County youth to get them released. We've pushed the governor because he has control over the state youth prison system to push for release. And so the main arguments around release are that, of course, youth are better served at home, closer to their homes, in their communities. Incarceration is developmentally not appropriate for them. So when we're talking about arguments for how to release them, first, there's one argument that Stephen mentioned, with if they're medically vulnerable. Generally incarcerated people, and including young people, have higher rates of things that will make them more vulnerable to COVID, including things like asthma. So you release the medically vulnerable. You release young people, or don't detain them in the first place, who are in there for low-level offenses. So misdemeanors, some felonies. There are unfortunately a high number of young people who are incarcerated for what are called technical violations. So you get put on probation, supervision, you don't go to school, you do a bad drug, whatever it is, and then you can be locked up for that as well.
Let me just interrupt you for 1 second. And we'd love you to keep on going on with your list, but I'm just interested in what you and your attorney found. What was the situation when you said, uh-oh, we better start doing something here? Or it didn't happen that way? You just, the pandemic started to develop and you said, we got to get involved with this immediately?
Yeah, well, so once we knew about the pandemic, we immediately knew we had to get involved, because there have been histories of outbreaks in facilities, both juvenile and especially in adult prisons and jails before. So there's science and data that show that this was going to be a huge problem. I mean, it's the nice version, like the other version people say it's like the cruise ship, right? People saw the cruise ship and like expand that, right? So we knew that was already going to be a huge problem. So we mobilized immediately. So once the study—
So you were proactive?
Yes, we were very proactive about it, and everyone mobilized there. And of course, you know, as you do that, you start to learn different things. So you think about all the measures that CDC, everyone asks us to do when it's social distancing, it's hygiene, hand washing, and none of that was happening. Those types of protections, you do have to alter them when you're in a facility setting, but they weren't doing any of that. So first, you weren't getting PPE, neither staff nor young people were. Even when it comes to hand washing or hand sanitizer, one of the unique things about facilities is anything alcohol-based is considered contraband. So now you can't even really get hand sanitizer in there as well. Most of these facilities are really dirty. They're barely getting cleaned at all. You have young people, I'll speak about juveniles, they have recreation, they have classes. They were still sometimes going to classes. They were still playing basketball together. Staff was still in contact with them. They were still eating meals together. We talked to young people, they're still playing cards together. So none of that separation was happening. You can shift movements. So when you move young people in groups when they're eating together, so things you could do. You could stagger their meals. You can have smaller groups of people spend time together at a time. They weren't doing any of that.
So you were proactive, but they weren't being proactive.
No, they weren't. The one place I will say, and there are two things I could say that jump out, that one's positive and one's negative. The one positive thing that facilities did is that, so there's minimum standards that, well, let me push back on that one. Look, let me reframe. So in juvenile facilities in California, you get charged to speak to your child inside. So you can have, in a county I've seen, up to $13.65 for a parent to be able to speak to their young person for 15 minutes. So what a lot of counties did is when they had to shut down in-person visitation, they then lowered costs or made phone calls and video calls free to connect with their families more. That was one positive thing that happened, and they did it pretty quickly. When it came to education, on the negative side, they cut down education, but instead they started getting individual packets to young people, weren't getting graded, no special supports for young people with special education needs, with English language learners. So those were one positive, one negative response to that.
So they were unimaginative. Can we say that?
That'd be a nice way to put it, yes.
And also they were what? They seemed to be not that concerned, or they didn't know what to do. I mean, we're trying to understand how do these places function in terms of trying to take care of the welfare of the kids.
So I think it's hard. I try to avoid what the intentions are. I do think some people it wasn't a priority. right?
Mhm.
Like even when you look at recently, the governor moved, and so our adult prison system released thousands of people. It's not happening at the juvenile level. So one is just about prioritization. So they've actually responded much better at the adult level than the juvenile level. At the local level, like unfortunately, some people will say, yeah, they don't care. I mean, even we've been told of young people who are sick and their parents aren't even notified that they're sick. We've been pushing locally for at least transparency. Tell us what you're doing, right? Tell us how many tests you've been having, tell me, and none of that has happened. So there's no commitment to transparency, and they will always say it's a resource issue. You know, I would push against that. I think all of us would, and of course, cost saving measures are to release our young people. You can provide the services in a much more cost effective way in their communities, at homes, and provide those services even during COVID.
Okay, let's go to some questions from our reporters. Michael, let's have a question, please, for Dominique.
Yes, thank you. So there are quite a few questions regarding ICE's treatment of children in their facilities. I know Ms. Nong just touched on, you know, the educational opportunities offered to them. So I was wondering if the two panelists could talk a little bit more of the treatment of children in ICE custody, and more specifically, how, if at all, does ICE handle allegations of sexual abuse against children? And also, we heard during the debate last night that unaccompanied children are being treated well. So what is your assessment of that?
Okay, let's go to Stephen first on that. And Chris, if you could have Michael's picture up on the screen, we'd appreciate it. Go ahead, please, Stephen.
Sure. I think, I think there's a lot to say about this. And so I'm trying to figure out where to start. I think, you know, there have been ongoing concerns about sexual abuse allegations for children who are held in immigration custody. And this actually goes to both ICE and ORR, I think, because there's been incidents, I guess, you know, I know more about the ORR system, and there definitely have been allegations in the past of sexual abuse happening to kids who are in ORR custody. I think, you know, on the ICE side as well, I think there's sort of, you know, ongoing concerns. Like, obviously, you know, like what I said earlier is that, you know, typically when ICE holds children in custody, they're with family members in family detention. And so like they're most often with their parents already. And this is not to say that like mitigates the concern of sexual abuse, but I think, you know, there's sort of broader questions within family detention about the conditions in which people are held. I think that's been an ongoing concern for a while. And that there have been lawsuits filed, for example, seeking the release of families from family detention based on, you know, the arguments that Dominique was talking about earlier, which is that, you know, it's dangerous to hold people in congregate settings, especially large numbers of people during the COVID pandemic. And so, you know, conditions monitoring remains like, you know, a problem that, you know, we're all still concerned about. I think when it comes to, it's a little hard to understand what the president was talking about in terms of unaccompanied children being held in, you know, treated well in custody. I think there's like a lot of documentation, particularly in the CBP, like Customs and Border Protection context of children held in pretty horrendous conditions. I think while they're at the border. And I think those facilities are definitely what we view as like the most problematic actors in some respects when it comes to the custody of kids. And so, you know, if we're talking generally about conditions of confinement for children held with families or held alone, I think, you know, there's still a lot of work that folks are doing and a lot of monitoring and concerns that people have about those conditions. And so.
Dominique, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, since it was specifically about the immigration side, except I will say that unfortunately, you know, the sexual assault issues happen on the state level side as well. And I think that generally our facilities, especially because you have young people in there, and whether it involves other young people or involves staff, there are a lot of improvements that can be made to protect them. So yeah, but it's something that unfortunately.
Well, in the state facilities, I mean, how prevalent is it? I think is what the questioner might want to know.
You know, I think, and this is something, speaking to journalists, there's always going to be an information gap. So I wouldn't be able to give you a percentage, right? And a lot of times what happens is you have organizations like the ACLU and other organizations who are able to go in and do those class action lawsuits And that's when you hear more about them. So I wouldn't safely be able to give you a number, but except to say that I know that it does happen, and I've heard stories and represented people.
If I can follow up, Dominique, with a question on that, Steve Handelman. Have you seen any fallback in claims of abuse, sexual or otherwise, for kids in detention as a result of the pandemic? Has that begun to abate? That may be one of the good things about the pandemic in terms of its impact on kids in detention.
So I haven't heard of any decreases in abuse. Again, one of the biggest things is one of the biggest concerns we've had is their doors are closed, right? So a lot of where we get our information and where from people who young people trust are either their parents coming in or programming where outside organizations are coming in, teachers, and all of that's locked. So I actually say we have less information about what's going on inside than we normally do. A lot of the information we get right now, it's either because we work directly with families or we work directly with public defenders. So that's where we're getting our information. So even just based on that, I'd be aware of saying these are going up or down, but I do know that one concern that we've had before, and it's an issue I've worked on, is the use of chemical spray. It's like an extreme version of pepper spray, right? That people using on protesters, like inside facilities. And we've actually tried to ban that because of the extreme harm that it causes, especially because it's causes a lot of respiratory harm. But the concern is that now that you're going to want to stay socially distanced, we already have staff saying it is safer for us to pepper spray a young person because then we can stay farther away from them, right? And they were saying that before COVID happened. So honestly, I have a concern that use has increased, but we don't have the information to know if that's actually true or not.
Are there particular states you want to call out, or particular jurisdictions you want to call out who are doing better than others or worse than others?
For COVID or for chemical spray?
For COVID in general, for how they're treating them.
I can only speak to California. I think I honestly wouldn't want to highlight any counties that have done better than others. I think we have concerns all across the different counties. And frankly, there's been a lack of transparency. I will say Los Angeles County, where I am, has been better about being more transparent. So we push to have data posted about, like I said before, number of tests, positive tests for both people inside and staff, many responses towards them. It was a big fight, and actually reporters helped us with that, to get that actually put and shared with the public. But before that happened, LA County was at least sharing that information publicly beforehand. But
let me just follow up here with one question. Okay, so have there been serious outbreaks of COVID-19 in youth facilities, lockdown facilities here in California? I mean, what's the situation been like in terms of kids contracting the pandemic, the virus?
So we haven't had, this is again where media becomes important because that's where a lot of the information comes from, but we haven't had the same type of outbreaks we've had on the adult side. So on the adult side, there was a huge outbreak in San Quentin prison. We haven't had a version of that. I can tell you as of October 13th, in our state youth prison facility, there's 3 of them that houses overall about 800, there are 68 positive tests and 28 staff who had tested positive. But we haven't heard about sort of the typical outbreaks that we heard about on the adult side.
Okay, thank you. Michael, next question, please.
Yes, thank you for those answers. The next question we have, I'm going to combine some here. So a few reporters are asking, what other issues besides family separation or children detention do you think that reporters should be paying attention to in terms of immigrant children and families? And how do you think journalists should cover those issues in a way that is ethical?
Stephen?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the big issues that we're dealing with now is, something I referred to at the beginning of the discussion, which is essentially the border lockdown on preventing unaccompanied children from entering the country. And so, like I said earlier, these are kids who are fleeing pretty horrific violence and conditions within their home countries, and they're statutorily entitled to certain important safeguards when they come to the United States. And what the government is doing on the basis of a public health justification is basically expelling them and turning them around at the border. And I think, we have a lawsuit going about this issue in DC on behalf of a 15-year-old Guatemalan boy who was subject to expulsion. And luckily we stopped his deportation with our lawsuit. But there's thousands of other children like him who are subject, at risk of being returned to serious danger. And I think that's an issue that I think definitely deserves additional coverage, especially because there's increasing reports coming out that although this border lockdown is done pursuant to a set of CDC orders and regulations, it seems like there was a lot of pressure from political officials and the White House to actually have CDC do this, and that actually CDC's own scientists were objected to it and refused to sign off on it, but were made by their higher level officials to forced basically by their higher level officials to institute this policy based on political pressure from White House officials. And then there was, just a report in I think the Times or the Post today that came out about the government efforts by government lawyers to get CDC officers to submit testimony in litigation about this issue, and then CDC officers refusing to do that because they didn't want to sign off on something they didn't believe in. And so I think that's an interesting dynamic that I think definitely deserves some additional coverage. I think as to ethics, I think, I don't know. It's hard for me to know how to speak to that because like each case can be so nuanced, I think. And I think there's like a lot of different considerations that come into play depending on the youth of the child and depending on their circumstances. I think, that could warrant in some respects a whole other discussion. And I think to some extent that's like a really case-by-case determination. And I think I'd be interested to sort of know if there's sort of specific ethical issues that have arisen for reporters who are trying to report on these issues. But yeah, I think, definitely, we think there's a way to cover this stuff ethically for sure. And I think a lot of it really depends on, the relationship with a particular child as well as the child's specific circumstances. So, yeah.
Dominique?
I just wanted to jump in on that last part about the ethics, which I really appreciate. I know just wanted to flag that on the juvenile system, everything's supposed to remain confidential. So members of the public aren't allowed in hearings. Your records are sealed and not open to the public the way once you're an adult, those records are. And I think one of the biggest things that I would love journalists to remember, because I have had some issues with this before, is the confidentiality and the importance of that confidentiality for the young person and for the family. And I think, honestly, if you're ever trying to get a personal story from families, making sure what their status of their cases are, because sometimes they don't know the specifics of it, and really consulting with an attorney if they have one, because they could be saying things, revealing things that could really harm them that they may not be thinking about. So I think that's one big issue. I also think another issue is, this is not so much ethical as much as an approach, is that really respecting and lifting up the stories of young people and seeing their humanity and putting in the larger context. I know when I talk to some young people, people talk about feeling like tokenized, right? Like they get spoken to, they have this big story, and then, but you only get a little sound bit, either quotes get cut or the way that they're framed. So I think really just being gentle and open-minded and really thinking of the youth and their potential and really trying to give them space to tell their story is huge. But then, as an attorney, the confidentiality piece is really important to keep in mind.
Well, given that confidentiality piece, how there are a lot of journalists, I'm sure, who would like to know, how can they get in touch with youth that have been detained or have been in detention and have stories that need to be told?
Sure. So one easy thing is that, at least with LA County, well, actually, and across the state, there are actually a lot of organizations that really work with young people and families who are formerly incarcerated or have people incarcerated. And because the organizers, they will come to meetings right? They'll come to public meetings and speak. So there are reporters there who can then pull them. There are also policy organizations who are there. So for example, reporters can reach out to me and say, hi, I'm looking for someone who, if there's a specific issue you want to cover, there are a lot of organizations that either work directly with young people or work with organizations that work directly with them. And then we can reach out and say, okay, we found someone, or here's our story. So policy organizations can be a resource, community-based organizations that are there are, at least in California, some very prominent ones that directly work with young people as well. And then we have resources with the public defender. So oftentimes if there are issues, and that did happen with COVID, that there were some specific requests, we do have networks. So I would definitely view organizations like Children's Defense Fund, me, community-based organizations as resources, for sure.
Can you name just a few others that they might off the top of your head, or is that?
Sure. If I could go by county, so in LA County, I would say Children's Defense Fund, Anti-Recidivism Coalition would be really great. Urban Peace Institute is really helpful. Arts for Healing and Justice. That used to be the Arts for Incarcerated Youth Network. Up in Oakland, they're called Courage, Communities United for Restorative Justice, Youth Justice. That's in Oakland. In San Joaquin, there's Fathers and Families of San Joaquin. So they're in Stockton. RISE, the RISE Center, RYSE, is in Richmond. MILPA, MILPA, is in Salinas, California. So those are just some. I can
Okay, great.
But I was like, here are my specific youth-based ones.
Okay,
Dominique,
Michael,
the links to those, if you send it to us, we'll put them on our site for journalists to click on. Joe, we have a couple of really good questions for Dominique as well. If Michael.
Okay, Michael, questions please for Dominique.
Yes. One question is, if Senate Bill 10 in California becomes a law, will it be a danger to youth ensnared in the criminal justice system? And if you wouldn't mind, can you give us a brief overview of what the Senate Bill 10 is?
Are they talking? I'm sorry. I actually would love, which year are they? I think they're talking about a prior year. Is that the bill? What could they actually clarify which bill they're talking about for Senate Bill 10?
Isaac, who asked that question.
Yeah, I think it, from what I see, it's the one about releasing an immigrant on his or her own recognizance and assuming that they'll return.
Oh, I would pass that to Stephen then if it's immigration. When I think of Senate Bill 10, I was thinking of a prior year with bail reform. So.
Okay, well, let's wait on that, and we'll, maybe Isaac can clarify what he means and go on to the next question.
All right.
Michael, can you go to the next question, please?
Yes, sorry. Okay, next question. We have another question that says, have your access to your clients or attorneys' access to their clients been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I think we can both say yes. I can speak a lot to the public defenders that we communicate with a lot. Yes. There's a lot, and it's not just access to the young people when they're locked up and talking to them. There's also a lot of issues with court and how it's doing video, how court appearances are happening. So the short answer, and Stephen could speak more, I'm sure, in that context, is there's a definite yes. And there are public defenders, especially in California, who are really great about trying to troubleshoot and see what they can do to get as much information as possible. And I will say one of the big things is that video or calling is not a good enough substitute for in-person visits. There's just a different level of information and rapport that you need that you can only get by being face-to-face with a person. But Stephen, I saw you unmute.
Yeah, we've heard that before. Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's similar. Like, obviously, the pandemic, basically most facility visits in ORR shelters, for example, are barred now. I think this, often in the ICE context, facility visits are heavily restricted as well. I think maybe the biggest concern we have is that, I referred earlier to serious conditions issues at the border facilities that CBP, Customs and Border Protection, operates. And those facilities have always been problematic when it comes to visibility, when it comes to attorney access to people who are detained there. And, essentially because of the border lockdowns, because of lockdowns in the states in which a lot of these facilities are located, I think, basically those facilities have become much more of a black box even than they were before. And I think in some respects, they're like the most problematic actor in the immigration system. I mean, there's a lot of problematic actors, but CBP is definitely high on that list. And I think because of that, there's a lot of concerns about what's going on in those facilities when there is now almost no visibility into what's happening there. So, yeah.
Isaac has clarified what he wanted to find out from Dominique, and he's talking about it's a Proposition 25 on bail reform.
Yes, okay. That's what I figured. I was like, SB 10 was turned, led to Prop 25. And the question was its potential effect on young people. Was that the question? Or
Yes, I believe so.
Yes, that was the question.
Yeah, will it be a danger to youth ensnared in the criminal legal system is how we put it.
So I will say from the very start, that has been a really tough issue that people are on both sides of. We've been focused less on it because it's on the adult. It's on the adult side. I will say that what is scary is that we do still have young people who are transferred into the adult criminal system. So for those young people, surely it would be, they're affected, but it's such a complicated thing about that. I don't think I'd feel comfortable speaking confidently about whether there's a direct harm or not to young people.
Okay, we have about 7 minutes left. Joe, I wonder if you mind if I ask sort of a general question to both of the speakers.
Go right ahead, please.
Wrap up. So, there's been a lot of talk about, since, we began being affected by the pandemic, that for the justice system as a whole, it's offered a huge opportunity for reform across the board. People are now beginning to think that maybe we don't need to put so many people in jail. We don't need to incarcerate so many people. And the same things have been said about the juvenile justice system. And I wonder whether in each of your areas of the system that you deal with, whether you see those opportunities for change as a result of the pandemic, and how would we take advantage of them?
And also, I'd like to add on to that question. Are there any roadblocks to reform as a result of this pandemic? So please, Dominique, you want to go first, please?
Sure. So I will say in California specifically, we have made so much progress, and we do have a lot of momentum in decreasing incarceration, and it's been tremendous. I will say that in LA specifically, our local halls and camps or locked facilities decreased their population by 30%. And the boards of supervisors unanimously passed a motion to put together a group to figure out how do we maintain that population decrease and potentially decrease it even further. And so that's one of so there is momentum here. I mean, there are already some people who are pro incarceration, I would say, who are saying, well, because of COVID, there's less crime. So there's going to be a huge spike. When in reality, crime has been decreasing for over decades now. So that's not the case, but people are ready to give the other arguments. But yes, there is momentum. And I think one of the greatest things with COVID on the positive side for reform is that there are new allies. So for example, now we know we have the Physicians for Criminal Justice Reform that have really spoken up. And there have been a lot more connections between advocates, defenders, service providers, and directly community members to really bring a strong coalition to strengthen our arguments moving forward.
Stephen?
Yeah, I think I'd echo that. I think there's similar energy on the immigration side as well. I mean, we've been talking, within our movement, especially, a lot about over-incarceration of non-citizens subject to deportation for a long time. And it feels like those arguments have some new life. I think, it'll be interesting to sort of, examine the role of, I think, private prison companies in all of this too, which has been historically a big problem in the ICE context. I think there's sort of economic incentives for ICE and its contractors to, maintain a certain number of occupied beds, let's say. And I think that's been historically one of the biggest barriers we see as decarceration within the ICE context. And I think hopefully, the COVID pandemic leads to further conversation about that as well, about why is it that you need to hold so many people in ICE custody and who really benefits from that. So, yeah.
So Dominique, how concerned are you in terms of moving backwards if Congress doesn't pass the kind of COVID-19 relief and the services are cut back for kids because of the budget crunch, a possible budget crunch?
Yeah, I think I have to stay optimistic in my work. No, but I actually think, even with the budget cuts, it strengthens one of the arguments that we consistently make, is that it is actually far more cost effective and just effective overall to not incarcerate young people and to keep them in their communities and provide services in their communities. And so that has been a stronger argument these days. And I will say, in California, that Governor Newsom proposed to shut down the state youth prison system, right? There were 800 youth in there. It was mostly empty. And clearly that was for budget cuts. However he wants to frame it, that's what it was. And it's actually something that advocates have been trying to do for decades, is to close this youth prison system. So we were able to do it. Of course, the devil and angels are in the details. But that was something that happened this summer as a result of the budget restraints. That were positive. So I'm more hopeful than anything.
Okay, we have about a minute left. So let me ask just one more question. Steve, what's the story that has to do with the youth that you want to see covered that's not being covered? Dominique, same question to you.
That's a good question, a really good one. I think for me, a lot of what's been on my mind is, I think the COVID border lockdown. I think to me, it sort of is emblematic of a lot of problems with this administration's treatment of immigrants. I think invoking sort of spurious justifications to basically enforce its immigration policies, and even overruling the objections of its own experts to try to enforce it. And I think to me, there's like a lot of interesting angles in that kind of story for sure. And so, yeah.
Dominique?
That's such a tough one. but I actually think something that would be most helpful, that I think it's probably one of the biggest misconceptions, is what young people are actually arrested for and detained for. Because people always think that it's murder, it's attempted murder, it's a violent offense, where the vast majority of things that young people are arrested for, locked up for, are much more minor things. Like, I've represented a young person in Baltimore that stole a bag of chips from a corner store and didn't even get out the door, right? There are a lot of offenses that come out of school that are really minor. So I wish that people knew more about how low level a lot of these offenses are that young people are getting locked up for.
So thank you both. I guess it was inevitable that we were going to be talking about kids at the border after last night's debate. And there's a lot of questions on that. If any of you have questions that haven't been answered, we will bundle them and put them to the panelists and speakers afterwards, and then post their answers online. If you guys don't mind answering them, and we'll put them on later. But thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And thank you, Joe and Michael. We're going to take a quick 5 or 10 minute break. We'll make it 10 minutes. And then we're going to move on to our next session, which will be a longer one, on shaping the new priorities for youth justice reform. So stand up, get your eyes off the screen, have a coffee, and come back to us in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you for all the valuable work you do.
No, thank you guys for having us.
Thank you guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.